we really found ourselves quite alone. And anyway, when my mom got out of the hospital, my older sister had taken care of us kids during that time, and the older brothers just spun out of control, a lot of drug abuse, and so much so that I have 5 siblings who are no longer alive because of the tragedy that was visited by my dad, who walked away, and everything that happened left us exposed as a family. And so my mom gets out of the hospital, and she herself is trying to make sense out of life. Her faith had been shattered. She had, really believed that the church would be there, and the church wasn't. And they just didn't know what to do with us. Does that make sense? It was the early 60s. They just didn't know what to do with us. Anyway, so she was in a singles bar, and she met a guy who was going to end up being my stepdad. That was God's plan. He didn't know it at the time. He was just shooting pool. And anyway, a single guy, and he met this cute lady that was over at the counter, and they struck up a conversation. And so anyway, he invited her, out, and she said, "Well, why don't you come over for dinner? I'd love to cook you dinner." And he said yes, and they made a date, and so here he comes, not knowing there were 8 children waiting for him, which we were all scrubbed and ready for dinner by the time he arrived. And can you imagine the surprise of my stepdad when he shows up and here's 8 kids, me being one of them. So they fell in love and got married, and this man to this day is my dad. He raised us. He rescued me. He's an extraordinary human being. Never finished his sophomore year in high school. He's comes from Georgia, peanut farmer down in southwestern Georgia, and little guy, maybe 5'7" tall, might weigh 130 pounds, and I get to spend next weekend with him. And I love that man, but I remember when I was in my 20s, it dawned on me what he did. And so I asked him, "Dad, I have a question to ask you, because you came and there were us 8 kids, and that was the first date, and yet after dinner you said goodbye, and then you came back. What were you thinking?" And here's what he said. He said, well, he just thought, he's a very simple man, but he said, I looked around and I thought, somebody has to do something. That's what my dad told me. Somebody has to do something. I just want to suggest something. The pain in people's lives is met with the presence of Jesus, who cares about them. I want to suggest we were a family in pain, and that Jesus was there, who deeply cared. And somewhere somebody was praying for the Koop family, and God sent an unsaved peanut farmer from Georgia to meet a woman in a bar, to be invited for dinner, to have an encounter with this family, and as an unsaved person be moved by God to say someone has to do something, to have a response of integrity and obedience that would outstrip what Christians were doing, much in the same way that my gay neighbors are responding in the same way to the need that we have, and our Christian neighbors aren't. That's the kind of theology that I live with. I really believe what I've just described, and I just think that the prayer was answered, and God sent our family a dad, and he rescued us kids, and I will never forget that man, and never fail to love him and honor him. But that's how the church is born, and I think that the church planting focus in our movement is to be very, very focused on 2 things, and that's to penetrate culture and to transform communities. I think that's what we want to see happen. And culture has become such a difficult thing to describe. And yesterday during the session, I really appreciated the conversation about culture it became a very slippery thing. It was very difficult to really kind of pin down what culture is. And it changes so rapidly and emerges in such an amazing, quick, and dramatic way. The only way that we can continue to penetrate cultures and thereby transform communities is through the reproduction of churches from leaders who are from within those cultures, who understand those cultures. And so every movement, like ours, for instance, has to become younger, has to become more diverse. You have a far greater diversity in your movement in terms of race and ethnicity than we do. I've noticed, I've been at your gatherings. For us, we're far more white middle class. And over the last year, we've seen the numbers of African American churches more than double in our movement. We've seen 51% of our church plants over the last 3 years have been other than white ethnicity in our movement. So things are changing for us. That's really a big deal. And yet, you know what? We had to see the change happen years ago before we could even get to a place where we could measure it today. And so I basically see the church in three different ways. I see the church historically, I see the church presently, and I see the church prophetically. And historically, I think Foursquare, Grace Communion, you can look at where you came from. You can look at your foundations. You can look at your heritage and everything about that is redemptive and something that informs who you are, that you love and appreciate and honor God for. That's the church historic. That's our foundation, and we really do owe that foundation and heritage a lot. The church presently is the church that is in existence today. And for better or for worse, that church is there. I can be in any number of Foursquare churches in a week, and in some cases, I wish the name Foursquare wasn't on the sign outside. Just to be honest with you, there's a few times where I'd just like to erase the name Foursquare because it doesn't really represent a church that I'm proud to be a part of. But for better or worse, that's the way it is. Fortunately, most of the time, I'm very glad to be a part of that church. And yet I recognize that the moment that a church is being effective in a community and doing what God has called it to do, that we celebrate that and recognize that there is this emerging culture that church can recognize but be somewhat limited in its ability to be able to reach. And that really is where the church prophetic comes from. From my view, is they recognize what they're not doing, what they're not able to do, and then begin to dream about who those will come and will do that. And I think the church presently has a huge responsibility to fuel the church prophetic, which is church planting. It really is. And we close every year only about 12 less churches than we plant. And that's a hard thing for me to digest. I think if we just stopped closing churches, we'd be in a lot better shape. But some churches, I think, are at a place where it's appropriate to close them. I don't think we should artificially keep churches open. But at the same time, how many of you would really believe that God would have us have a culture of intervention where we train pastors, we endorse pastors, affirm pastors, and support and invest in pastors in a way that they don't fall to that place where we have to close churches? That's really what we hope to see happen in our movement. And I really believe that if we do that well, we'll help church planners answer this question. And this is really what our focus is what does a life-giving, biblically faithful, Foursquare church look like in that particular context? So some of you are from Texas. Some of you are in rural towns in Texas. There's people I had dinner with last night who are in some smaller Kansas towns. Okay, it's different to plant a church in a small Kansas town than it is in New York City or Los Angeles or Dallas. We understand that. But the person on the ground, if they could answer this question, what does it take to plant a life-giving, biblically faithful GCI church in that context, then what happens is that every church will be life-giving. And you can define what that means. Every church must remain biblically faithful, and you have a very strong statement of faith, and you're grounded in solid Trinitarian biblical theology. By the way, the church globally, I believe, already owes you as a movement a debt. And last night, whenever Pastor Joe was talking about this repository online of this Trinitarian theology, please do that. Please do that, because around the world and in the church planting movements that I'm a part of, it's amazing the slippage that is happening on that particular issue. And if you lose the Trinity, you lose it all. And you have been called by God to hold that firm, and I thank you for that. That's really important. Biblically faithful is really an important statement. And then GCI has a unique identity and purpose in this world. God created you to accomplish something only you can accomplish. If you don't do it, it will remain undone.